Going a little deeper into the housing crisis that you see, like, how did you speak about that in the campaign, and like, what are the solutions that you've been working towards to really address this systemic, structural issue that's very complicated?
Right. You didn't have to really go that far into the housing crisis. I mean, people just can't afford the rent. It's very simple. They can't afford the rent and they can't afford to buy. So what does that mean for generational wealth? What does that mean for generations in a neighborhood? That means, we're finding that young people who would love to come back to the neighborhoods they grew up in have no home and no space because they can't afford to do it. So unless they were one of the lucky ones whose families own something, they are not coming back. And so we're losing a generation of Bostonians who grew up here in our neighborhoods. But more importantly, we're becoming less and less welcoming to individuals such as myself who came here. I was, fresh out of law school, just going to start my first job, going to try and make it in a big city. And at the time, the rent was affordable. There's no way I could do that now. There's no way I could move into Boston right now, fresh out of law school, and try to make it, or work for legal services, or work in social justice in this city. It's shameful. And so we're dealing with a crisis that's chasing away newcomers and also keeping away a new generation of Bostonians. And and everyone feels that across all racial lines, across all class lines even. We're finding folks who are making six-figure salaries who are saying, I can't afford a $600,000 condo, one bedroom. That does nothing for me. So we have this crisis. And so what we need for this crisis, we do need to build, but we need to build for the individuals that we want to be part of our neighborhood. Building alone, just for the sake of building, assures that we will set ourselves up to create more, I call them pieces of stock, for the speculator class in our housing. We are not building for families. We are not building for our middle class. We're not building for workers. And until we do, you can build all you want. It doesn't trickle down. Housing doesn't trickle down. It is a segmented market. So if you want prices for student housing to go down, you build student housing. Building student housing doesn't help families, though, and their prices to go down. You need to build more family housing. And that's what I think a lot of folks get confused. And there's certainly a division even amongst progressives. There's my friends who are YIMBYs, and those are my friends who are, I guess YIMBYs would call them NIMBYs. Those are yes in my backyards versus no in my backyards. And densers who build anything and everything and build as much as possible, because then eventually prices will, they adopt a market strategy that, the more product that you create, the cheaper it will be. You can create all the housing you want, and all it's doing is inviting people who don't live here to come here, which is fine, but you're not actually helping those who live here get any cheaper in terms of their rent. So we proposed, for example, a luxury transfer fee in Boston. It's a home rule petition. We need to pass it at the city council that would increase, or on every sale, $2 million or more that is not an owner-occupied building. These are literally investment properties that are sold for $2 million or more. There would be a 6% fee added to it, and that would generate, I think the number reported and what we are comfortable with is about $400 million based on the sales a year based on the sales trends for the last 4 years. So we just keep doing that. If we were to just reduce that, or I think if we were to just do commercial properties and stay away from residential altogether, we could over $100 million.
So could I zero in on this a little bit? One of the core questions, as I know you've worked so hard on and that others are starting to pay more attention, is this enormous wealth gap. It's partially racially driven, it's a growing economic and class division, and part of the question around that is, what are the mechanisms for people who don't have very much to accumulate wealth? And the work that I've done in the solidarity economy, new economy, and so forth is really looking either to restore mechanisms for wealth building that used to exist, but that are moving away, and I'll speak about that briefly, or to create new wealth generation mechanisms so that people can share, whether it's a small business or owning a property. One of the things my wife and I discovered more than 20 years ago in Somerville was that, first of all, Somerville had built wealth for working class people by having the triple decker. And so you would start out and you would buy a place, and you would get that mortgage and you'd live in the first floor, and your mother might be on the second floor to help with the kids, and then you'd rent with the third floor and you'd generate some income. And then over time, the use moved, and who could live where and who needed to live where. But I knew many people when I first moved into Somerville in the 80s who finally had paid off the mortgage for the triple decker, and they sold the building and they retired to wherever they wanted, often Winchester or Arlington or New Hampshire. We don't have that mechanism now because so many of those buildings have become condos. And in our particular case, we found a single family that happened to have a small apartment on the third floor. And initially I said, oh, that's too much responsibility, but we ended up renting to young couples who in the end we were also able to figure out how they could help with our young daughter. And so we created a little kind of mini co-housing community in some ways. So I guess what I'm asking is the new economy, solidarity economy, puts a lot of emphasis on making sure that people have things that they can own that will build wealth. And one of those is housing. And yet, the way the market's been working, it's been breaking it into individual condos, building things that don't meet the needs of important populations. And so that leads to a real conversation about how do we want to structure things so that people can own them and build wealth and start to reverse some of that huge gap that has been identified by the Federal Reserve and others. Long question.
I don't know what it is, though.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just talk. I mean, you said we can get out of this partly by building more. I would add to that, we need to think about ownership structures that make it possible for people to, over time, not just to ride up a regular speculation model, but really to build and invest in the community as human beings. And so, anyway, I just raised it because it's something we've observed in Somerville and something that we live through. Do you think there's any opportunity, for example, in any of your districts or even with Suffolk Downs to create structures that would really help people build wealth?
So I think what's key is that the city needs to invest and provide the funding and raise the revenue in order to support families to invest. In order to, we have a first-time homeowner program, and they're graduating classes of individuals, and none of them can afford to buy it anyway. Sure. So it's a setup in a way that puts people in positions to know how to buy and can't afford to. So that's why we need to generate the revenue to give them the assistance. Either they're helping with down payment assistance and providing a second level of funding, looking at, I think there's some really great models throughout the country of real estate investment cooperatives where communities have come together and individuals have put in investment stakes and have began, not even call it, they began to invest and own and develop in their own communities collectively so that the profits aren't going back to an individual who doesn't live there. It's going back to the community in a community fund. So I think it was in Minnesota, they actually bought blighted areas collectively, then rented them out. The rents ended up being the revenue that they gave back to all their investors, which were people who lived in the community. And it was for a $1,000 buy-in that you can now collectively create a down payment fund to go buy certain things. We've seen that model even in Charlestown with city land, and there was like 9 families who came together and they were able to buy collectively, and then they refinanced into individual mortgages so that they built up the houses on a collective buy-in and then refinance in a way that they then had their individual mortgages. So it can happen, but the issue is it needs to be brought to scale, and you need financing to bring it to scale. It's not lack of creativity, it's just lack of financing, it's lack of will.
Well, I just want to follow this one more bit. I mean, one of the things that I found so infuriating, so just briefly, before I ran for governor, I was running a program at UMass Boston called the Sustainable Solutions Lab. And it was looking at the pressing economic and social justice needs of many communities in Boston, particularly communities of color, and the tension that they are coming under and will come under as climate change gets worse. And I know that climate change is something that you've given considerable thought to. So you have this kind of two major forces. So the folks who need intervention and investment now to build social resilience, and then the longer-term physical resilience and addressing issues of displacement that, of course, are already happening under gentrification and are likely to continue under climate change. And so these issues of how do you help people, how do you help communities at the same time that you have a city that, in my judgment, made a terrible set of mistakes by committing $18 billion of public and private investment to the Seaport District, the most likely to flood place in all of Massachusetts, and without engaging in a satisfactory way the communities of color that were just a few miles away. And this could have been a profound injection of capital, and yet they didn't do it. So there are, and in fact, they went out of their way not to do it, as was exposed by the Globe study of this. So. So all these pieces are at work, the kind of housing, lack of investment, lack of ownership, the growing tension of climate change, and then the flat out refusal or ignorance or whatever it is that has prevented these opportunities from being directed in a manner that would make a real difference. So you're right smack in the middle of all that. Right. And how do you hope to persuade the city council or to move people forward and to see opportunities that are now being missed?
Well, I mean, you're correct. I'm right in the middle of it. And in terms of housing, I'm on the extremes of it in my district. We have the largest housing development or project in New England, in Charlestown, Bunker Hill. We also have the single largest private development in Boston's history at Suffolk Downs. They're going to create housing in Suffolk Downs, and they're going to try and renovate and renew and rebuild public housing in the other. In the public housing realm, we did get, for the first time, the city of Boston is going to bond to a tune of $30 million, at least this year in this budget. I think it's going to go up, and essentially invest in housing, which we should have been doing in bonding and housing for years. We've done it for other infrastructure, but now we're finally doing it for housing. And in that sense, we are learning how to build and provide sustainable, clean, affordable housing. And we need a public-private partnership for that. And it looks like we're going to have to become dense because the federal government has basically divested and is refusing to do its job. We don't have Hope 6 money anymore. We don't have federal money anymore. So what that means is we're going to have basically leverage private dollars for public housing, and that is controversial, but there's no other money. We don't have a transfer fee, for example. We're not generating revenue in a way that could pay for it. And I'm to a lot of the folks in Charlestown's credit, they want a one-for-one. They do not want a reduction at all in any of the deeply affordable units. But in order to have that one-for-one, you need to build.
Let me just understand. They want to see an increase in affordable housing. They don't want to swap out affordable housing for gentrified housing. When you say one-to-one, they want to
They want a one-for-one. So there's a deeply affordable, there's 1,100 deeply affordable units now. They want 1,100 deeply affordable units later. And in order to pay for those to be dignified, clean, modern housing, we're going to have to put market rate in there somewhere. Yeah. And what that means is a good thing to a certain extent. I don't believe in concentrations of poverty, even if it is in nice new housing. I do think we should have mixed income housing. How big it's going to be, how dense it's going to be, and honestly how welcoming. You can put folks together, but you may not necessarily put them together and create a neighborhood. And whether the city can demonstrate that it has an infrastructure to support it. That increase in population. Charlestown is 1 square mile. We now just got a casino as a neighbor. We now are about to do this massive development for 12 years. So there's a lot to put on a neighborhood, and the fabric of it is we're really concerned about how that's going to happen. At Suffolk Downs, that I think is the best example of where you can, the lessons from the Seaport, if we can demonstrate we actually learned anything. We can demonstrate that we learned that unless you are intentional about building a neighborhood, one won't naturally happen. Developers don't do that naturally. They develop. They don't create neighborhoods. They don't create communities. That is not their job. That's why we don't have a school in the Seaport. That's why our parks don't make any sense in the Seaport. The one church that is there was there before the Seaport. There is nothing, I mean, if you find a woman or a father with a stroller and children walking around, that you let me know. If you see that, and if you see General Cummings together in the Seaport, it is a concrete development for folks who want to make money and for folks who did make money, and that's it. And that is, to me, the biggest lesson is that we, by letting it naturally happen, right? There was no organizing, there was no surrounding community around it to say that we demand these certain things, that they were given complete and total reign. The BPDA, the developers, they had all control there, and that's the best they can do by us.
Yeah, they blew it.
So how are you actively trying to engage the community to be part of this conversation? You know, you have to make sure all the voices are heard,
Right.
and it's not necessarily easy to get this message out through the media. I would assume, you know, getting what's going on and get people engaged to be
Right.
participants. What are some strategies you're actively taking, or what are some specific goals for this Suffolk Sound project that you would want to articulate to our community that they could
Right.
come and help you?
So we, so the PDA, Planning Development Agreement, was produced by the developer, and that's normal as part of these large kind of projects. They have to produce they propose the zoning, and that's what this is. So 150 pages of proposed zoning from the developer saying this is how I could be regulated. These are the uses that I suggest. This is how I'll deal with housing, how I'll deal with jobs, transportation, all these other things. They propose that, and the BPDA traditionally gives 45 days. We push for up to 90. And we also push for that 150 pages to be put in Spanish, because Suffolk Downs is between East Boston and Revere. I would say 75% of Suffolk Downs is on the Boston side, only 25% is in Revere. So we pushed for that to be longer and to be in Spanish, and then they had one meeting in English, one meeting in Spanish, and I found that to be a dereliction of duty. So my office, put on 5 additional meetings, organizing the community and citizen educators, we called them. So we had them come into City Hall. These are folks in East Boston who are already are conveners on certain topics. Some are really passionate about the soup kitchen and folks in recovery. Some were really passionate about traffic, others about housing. We had another one on jobs and labor. So we convened these natural
Citizen, what did you call them?
We call them citizen educators.
Uh-huh.
And so we took the 150 pages and reduced it to 7 pages. And then began to meet with folks in English, and we had an English and Spanish, saying this is how we're seeing this 150 pages. This is our summary of them. All of it cited with footnotes and demonstrating this is the issues, or these are the questions that we're still left with. Looking at, for example, the average family size for transportation purposes is 1.58. That's what they're planning for.
1.58.
1.58. That's smaller than the Seaport. And in East Boston, our average household size is 2.6. So the question became, who are you planning for then?
Right.
Are you seeing us in this neighborhood? Because I don't see us in this neighborhood. Looking at the affordability levels for, being consistent and only saying the maximum of affordability we're going to get is 13% in Suffolk Downs. I've called for 20%. A lot of the folks have called for the third, which they feel is a true mixed income and truly, I think, stabilized neighborhood. But the developer is consistent about saying 13% only. And of that 13%, we want to know how many are at which AMI, area medium index, the percentage. So for Boston, for those who don't know, the area medium index, or income, is about $100,000. Because the area includes Newton, it includes Brookline, it includes a lot of cities, and that brings up our average. So, because we have that average, then affordability is based off of percentages of that average. So right now, the AMI provided for a majority of the affordable units in Suffolk Downs are at 70%. So we're looking at a salary about $70,000. Okay, that's double than what a lot of folks make in East Boston and Boston in general. Average salary for I would say is about 50-ish for families in East Boston, and that's because we have a lot of folks coming in with higher incomes. So they're not planning for us. Even your affordability is unattainable for a majority of the folks who I represent. And so it's those kinds of questions. Also pushing to make sure that there's unions and there are union jobs and pipelines created for those union jobs. And so we had over 300 people show up between all these meetings from East Boston. We put out the call to a lot of advocates saying, you know, the public comment period is going to end May 31st. If you don't have an opinion about the single largest private development in Boston, I don't know who else would. So Greater Boston Legal Services, the Allendale Society, we had folks from all over the place come in, union folks, and it was just like, it's time. This is not how we do this now sets a precedent forever, you know, because this is forever. This is 20 years of development.